And then there'll be the choice of this morning's recording and also this one. Right. So I'm going to put another poll in through.
And I want to go including them.
So, yep, as it just with your mic on and off. You must have your mic on, Monica. Not that it matters, except that you're probably chatting. So what I want you to think about and reflect is, have you met, or what are the course learning objectives, and have you met them? And so we've got the 3 course learning objectives here. So I'll just go to the next slide. So the first one is about sort of finding knowledge for practice. This was what we looked at in the first tutorials. We identified how to search. We looked at developing a PICO or a PO, which is point of population interest and outcomes. You looked at how to decide on search terms and why, how to search databases and identify what studies are useful. So I'm going to put this poll through. Right. And so thinking about the first objective, do you think you've mastered that? We're getting some good response there, which is excellent. So the next course objective was this ability to summarize. So you can see here that hopefully you're moving from novice to advance, and hopefully you're becoming what I would consider now competent as ability to summarize and to identify what parts are in an article. So we still got a couple of people with their microphones on. Majali. Probably can actually turn it off. Oh, you've got it off. So in this next one is, so you should be able to know where to look for things in a research article, what the highlights, limitations, and abstracts and recommendations are, and also how to write a summary, and how to combine articles for recommendations. So just as a quick poll, so we've sort of, so the results of the first one were 3.2. So let's have a thumbs up and thumbs down on, do you think you've mastered this ability to summarize research and sort of know where things are? So we've got 7, so I should be getting 7 results on each of these polls. So 5. So most of you feel like you're getting there, which is good, because this is a sort of that next level of skill. And the last objective is evaluate, which is what we are looking at in A3. So this is to be able to read and identify answers to clinical problems, understand the research rules. So this is about sort of sample size, ethics, methodology, and sort of find them in the article. And critique research against the rules. So this is where we looked at, how you look at mixed method, what's meant to be in it, what is in it, and how does that sort of look for what you're reading, and to develop an analysis. And so you can see there in this evidence-based practice is a combination of, best research, your clinical experience, and patient preferences. So if I put a poll through on this one, how are you feeling that your confidence is on mastering this level, this ability to actually evaluate research? I might just close my door because it's... So when we're looking at this, so yeah, so this is a harder skill, but hopefully as you finish A3, you'll have this ability to feel a lot more confident in that evaluation. And so what does A3 actually look like? So we can see here that it's a critical evaluation. So always keep that in mind. It is not a summary. This is a critical evaluation, which means it's your critique. So you need to accurately identify and explain the different elements of the article and critically evaluate these elements using the template which we provide, and then look at that in relation to recent and relevant and scholarly literature. And then discuss with references the significant implications of research for contemporary nursing practice and standards of care. So basically, what does this article and what does this mean in relation if you're looking at recommendations for practice? So is that, and we can suppose have either a thumbs up in the poll or just thumbs up in the chat. When you're looking at that and looking at the article, does it start to make sense? Yes, it is. Good. Excellent. And so remembering that we have gone through this process numerous times of actually looking at and breaking down the research. So if you need to, you might need to go back to the modules to actually look at that. Remembering that the template is a guide, not for submission. So don't hand in your assignment in that table. But what we are looking for is something that goes along the following headings. Now, headings are included in the word count, so you can reduce them. You don't need to have PICO journal quality, title, abstract, literature review. You could just have, this section, like this is journal quality or PICO, and this is the literature review. This is the methodology. This is the sample. You could have headings along that line. Remembering this is a guide for your word count. So your overall word count is 1,500 words. This is just a guideline. So that gives you, enables you to sort of think about what do I need to put in the depth. But remembering that the research, the actual marking criteria is different and looking at different aspects than this. So the marking criteria, which I'm just going to bring up to show you. Looks at a general, remember in A2 it did the same thing. You wrote on something, but then we marked you. Yeah, you could just use introduction as your subtitle, definitely. This is the thing. It says your critical analysis. This is the article. So I might just do a quick poll, and hopefully most of you have actually looked at the article. So let's do a tick or a cross. Had you looked at the article and read it in full? So that's being launched. So I think everyone in the group has read the article. Excellent. How did we go? So we had 5 responses. So 60-40 for the being able to feel confident in the analysis, the critical analysis. Right. So the main thing to do next. So you've all read the article. Have you started the process of highlighting bits in the article to get and start filling out the table? So has anyone had any issues as they've been completing the table and finding the different sections that go in that table? Because then you need to then bring that information to answer the questions in relation to the marking criteria. the first aspect of the marking criteria is accurately identify and explain the different elements of the research process that are evident in the article. It's tricky when Martha's off sick today and I'm struggling to run the chat. Can data, so data integration, I'm not quite sure what you're meaning by that. So data analysis would be in the data analysis section. Data integration is where they bring the quantitative and the qualitative data together. So that is part of the results, because when you are presenting the actual data and integrating it together, which is what I think you're meaning, that's the results. The data analysis is how they've looked at the surveys, how they've looked at the interviews. That's the data analysis. The data collection is what they did to collect those surveys and those interviews. So this is where students will lose marks or gain marks if they've accurately identified the different elements of the research process. So you might need to actually, as you're reading the article, go back to the modules and go, okay, what does that mean? So, you know, when you're looking at this, the criteria 1 is the accurate identification and comprehensive explanation of the elements of the research process. So by that, what we're meaning is we don't want you to just say the research design was a concurrent mixed method. We want you to actually comprehensively explain that. So you will need to use an examples and then with references. So what does concurrent mixed method mean? Have they followed it precisely? What have they done in that process? So did they do interviews and surveys at the same time? And then your justification would be that for you know, a population of Indigenous people, completing interviews and surveys at the same time is appropriate because it would be difficult to get this population to come in for an interview at a different time. So that's you demonstrating your understanding not only of the research design and how it was done, but of the population. Just give me thumbs up or questions as I'm going through. So the second part of this criteria is to critically evaluate the research elements using appraisal template. So this is our guide. You've also got you know, aspects of the Corex, the mixed method appraisal tool, which you can use to, and that justification of this research quality that you use for criteria 2. So your task description is different from the marking criteria. So it's important when you're doing your task description that you're not purely summarizing, because you need to look at the criteria, which is about critiquing, which is what the first part is. So I know that's a little bit confusing, but the thing is we wanted you to be able to break down the article, but look at it not only in descriptive, but also as a critical analysis and a justification of this is good, this is not so good, this could be better, this could be done differently. So as you're going through the different parts, as you're putting that table together, put down your own comments of, yes, these results are well presented, the tables are clear, and I think in the table, we have all those questions for you to answer. So as you're looking at yeah, the data analysis, how were the quantitative results reported? How was the qualitative findings and used to support the quantitative result? How was it analysed? What was their technique? And this is where you use the justification, because otherwise we know that you're not, you know, and when you're writing up this sort of analysis, you're using other people's work to say, yes, this was correct or not correct. So the last criteria is about your discuss the significant implications of the research for contemporary nursing practice and standards of care. So this is this section here, relevance to clinical nursing practice, 250 words. So this is a big part of your word count for 10 marks, where the first part, the 1,000 words, is more just the actual you providing the answers to criteria 1 and 2. So in criteria 3, we're looking for this insightful and comprehensive discussion with multiple relevant examples, identifying sort of regarding the significant implications of this research for clinical practice. So what makes this research article useful for your practice? So in the chat, put some ideas. What makes this research useful for your clinical practice? Let's have a couple of ideas. Culture. So the question was, what makes this research article useful? And you might put as sort of in your comments for it's relevant to clinical nursing practice. It is, so if that criteria is worth 10 marks, how do you get full marks? You need to make sort of put some links towards insightful, comprehensive discussion with multiple relevant examples. So how do you put forward relevant examples? And how do you demonstrate that you understood? So where Jessica's put culturally appropriate care yarning, what you might do then it is an example of what yarning is. So you don't want to just use the words. So that's brilliant, the ideas you're coming up with. This, understanding the importance and level of education of First Nations people, how they talked. So there's that beautiful example of their qualitative comments about, the nurse used big words. And, the nurse spoke fast, and so we often do this as nurses. And so how can you understand this article and then put it to your own clinical practice? And more awareness of First Nations peoples. One of the comments from that earlier shoot was about, can they put in an acronym for First Nations people? And the answer is no, because it's actually considered quite culturally inappropriate. And so you notice throughout that whole article, they have not reduced it. And so I know it is 3 words, but you will just need to use it as those 3 words. And so the use of acronyms often detracts from your understanding. And so be very aware of thinking about how you can do your concise writing as opposed to using acronyms to reduce the amount of writing that you're doing. So, which brings me to this next point of concise writing. So have a look at the 2 examples I've got here. The first one, you get a 3-line sentence reduced down to 1 and a bit. And then again, 3 lines down to 1 and a bit. But noting that the information in the second sentence still provides the what is needed. And so have a read of those, and in the comments, think about your own assignments and your use of concise language. And did you get that as a comment in A2 about, using concise language, or reducing the repetition of points, or providing more depth? Because that was one of the sort of the main areas in A2 where students failed to give us the depth. And so when we're looking at marks, we needed to have the actual you demonstrating your understanding, not demonstrating your ability to summarize and use the same words that the article was using. So critical evaluation is where it is your opinion. So it's, it's difficult when you're just a beginning practitioner to have a sense of, do I have an opinion? But you do. So when you look at those tables, do they make sense to you? When you read that method in that article and you look at what mixed method is meant to look like, does it look the same? And so this is where your research justification comes in. So in the readings on the course site, I've put in a whole lot of articles to help you justify the research. And so you're writing, and you might sort of talk about, they recruited patients, and I'm pretty sure they recruited them. I've actually closed that PDF down. They've recruited the patients in clinics, and so I will just have to open it again. Has someone got the article open? I just have to pick it up. I can probably pick it up this way. So what you could look at is then, was it ethical? Did they ask the patients to be in their research the same day as they did the surveys and the interviews? Is that appropriate? They do have in the ethics, they do talk about cultural advisors and First Nations people. So that would be a positive justification, that they were talking with First Nations people and they were using them as part of the research. Just opening the article up again. So when you're reading that article and finding all the different parts, have you been able to sort of see the different aspects in the method? So if we look, they've got a quite depth background, and they have a diagram, so you can justify or critique. So does that diagram make sense to you in figure 1, the concurrent embedded mixed method? And so they did the quantitative and the qualitative at the same time, and then they put them together for the analysis. So does that make sense to you? When you look at mixed method articles, you can then justify this was a good method and that it enabled a clear understanding of the health literacy and what the people were saying. Did they have enough people doing their qualitative study? They had, and you can sort of say, yes, they did. The research, just the aims, because what their research question was to understand chronic disease education, self-management and health literacy abilities in First Nation Australians with chronic disease in remote Australia. So, you can look at that recruitment. So they recruited from 2 sites, and so you could comment that if they're looking at rural people, their sites were very appropriate. And you could maybe use the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, which looks at the identification of rural Indigenous people or First Nations people. To justify that, yes, that was appropriate. You could look at the numbers they had in their study. So I think they had 200. So is that a reasonable sample for a quantitative study to then use it with any depth? So you could actually look at and justify that with, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare notes that there's X number of Indigenous people living in rural areas. And so is 200, what percentage of that is? If there was 1,000 Indigenous people in rural Australia, rural Queensland, and you recruited 200, is that appropriate? So this is where it's not that you have to be researchers, but you have to start sort of understanding whether or not this is something that you could say, yes, this article really looked at what we can generalize with First Nations people in my clinical setting? Or do you look at it and say, actually, no, they didn't have enough sample, so maybe we need to do further studies? So that becomes your, in your recommendations, that further studies need to be done. Does that make sense? So they've got a nice, clear ethics there of, how they approach. So, the Aboriginal health worker approached the potential participants, but they did it all at the one time. So you might then look at an article which talks about the recruitment of Indigenous people, and that, do you allow them to go away? It's tricky because with Indigenous rural populations, recruiting and completing the study at the same time would probably be a good way to do it. But does it allow the participant time to think about it? Is that important if you're asking health literacy? And so your justification may be, because the study was not really personal, it wasn't asking about their experience of disease, but their understanding of health information, then maybe it was very appropriate, and the reference then you could use. So, I've sort of have a look at the work that talks about working with First Nations people, being culturally correct. So there's lots in that article that will make it your essay, because even though it's one article for 800 students, there's so much different things that you could bring. Remember, you don't need to have every point in your task description, in your actual essay, because this is your sort of identification and critique. So as you're going through the research design, you need to have accurately identified the different aspects, but then what you're bringing into this for the criteria too is your own sort of thoughts on that. So when people read the actual criteria, are you understanding how it will be marked? It will be a little bit difficult for our markers, because they are reading the work of US students, and then having to sort of bring, okay, have they identified the different parts? Have they been able to expand and provide depth on that? The use of older research would be appropriate also for this assignment, in the essence that if you're justifying a methodology or working with Indigenous people, it is likely to be older research. And so I've talked about sort of giving in your assignment, you might say, a seminal researcher, or, a previous research has identified this, and this, and no further research has been done, which identifies that this article, although it is maybe older, that there's no further work to actually use. So that's two ways to sort of demonstrate that you have looked to see if there's more current research, but there's nothing there. And the other aspects of presentation. So be aware of your writing, and as I've said before, go through that process of reading or writing, reading over it, reading it out aloud, and getting someone else to read it, because it should make sense. There is a PowerPoint that myself, Kathy Carmody, and Hilary did, which talks about sort of understanding your feedback, writing concisely, and responding, and making sure you're getting a depth and the flow in your writing. So I'll open it up now. It's past. So to specific questions about sort of that you might like answered, or has the sort of what I've gone through today helped you sort of understand what we're going from a specific report that you're writing to a criteria that you're getting marked on? Don't forget to have the correct spacing and front page. We did have students lose marks for not the correct front page, word count not being noted, no page numbers. And it's not a big number of marks, but it all just adds up. My chat doesn't scroll on. What is the correct font? What is the correct font? That is in, I would say, and I really don't quote me on this, apparently it is in the dashboard, the reading and writing. It's size 12. It's definitely double spacing. Yeah, Times New Roman. In the dashboard on the, I'm just trying to get it open. When you look at a course, the health writing and referencing guide has the information. And also, I think people were saying in the Nurses Connect, it's got the front page assignments. If you look at that, it's got the front page for assignments. So in this one, I've just got the chat. So if you found a reference that doesn't have a date, then it's probably not what you'd call a strong reference. Remember, we talked about that in the first of the shoots, that if it's not if it's not published in a journal and it doesn't have a clear citation, it's probably not strong research to you. So I'd find something else. Yep. So we've got, I'll just reading through. So Rihanna, so in the first aspect of the assignment about the research process is included in the template. First aspect of the assignment about the research process. So the assignment is you doing a report. So yes, that is what you're writing is what I've just got there, task description. James, so do we have to answer each question supplied under the heading on the A3 task instructions? What I've got present there, yes, but you can move, you can make those headings smaller. So it could be introduction, abstract, methodology, sample, data collection. But you do need to have it, because don't confuse your marker. Like, you could submit it without headings, but we've allowed headings because it does allow the marker to know exactly what you're talking about. Without headings, then how do we know you're talking about the abstract and title or not? Because when we're looking at the sort of accurate identification and comprehensive explanation of all the elements, it's easier if we can read them as we go down. Right, okay, now I'm up to Roxanne. Impact factor is the key so in this one, you don't really need an impact factor, because remember, the impact factor related to the journal quality. So in this, you could just, note that the Journal of Clinical Nursing, which is where this is published, has a strong impact factor. Or you may identify that, you just want to sort of use that in a sentence. Remember, you've only got 50 words, so you want to make sure you've got your population, your point of interest, and your outcomes. And you could talk, the first shoot talked about primary and secondary outcomes. So we've got the health literacy, but also we've got the ability to self-manage at home. I think, do headings indented or centered? I think they are indented. I'm not very good at the actual rules. I always have the rules beside me when I'm marking. But I'm pretty sure they're not central because for centered, it's not APA. It's very hard without Martha being here. Okay. Thank you, Ashley, for that exemplar. Headings are included in the word count because that's what we normally expect headings to be included in the word count. But they're not, you don't need to put the whole heading that we've got there. But yeah, and the thing is you've got a lot of words to use, 1,500, which you should be able to use, 10 words of that on headings. How were the qualitative findings used to support the quantitative results? So if you look on the article, they actually talk about the health literacy levels and the comments that the people put. That's how they've integrated that data. A comment, a critique would be what they haven't done is in each of these interviews, they would have actually done health literacy levels. And so, maybe a critique would be that, they actually health literacy levels of the people they did the interviews might have been important. So, when you look at them, there's one that's, Joe or whatever. So what was Joe's quantitative health literacy levels when he talks about the nurses using big words? So did he have very low health literacy, which is what their overall was, or was his health literacy okay? So remember that integration of the quanta and qual results is done as you're looking through the article in the results, because it brings them both together. It gives an overall what they did, and it talks about that data integration, so when they're talking about data integration, this is where they've mixed and used, and that's their reference, which you can use that reference as well. You need to go to that article and work out what Creswell and Clark actually talk about, because I think they've actually referenced that incorrectly. I don't think it's Plano Clark. I think it's just Clark. So have a check on that, because I remember even in publications, sometimes references aren't always perfect. And so they've done this overall about the quantitative findings, and overall then they've done a table of themes where they've talked about what it related to the actual health literacy levels. Right. I think I've answered all your questions. So I will just share screen and show you what I was talking about with so this is the article. And so this is where they've brought together. So this is where they talk about the findings. So data integration, and this is the reference that I was talking about. This is their rigor. So this is, remember, we talked about researchers having to have their research able to be understood by others and followed. And so in this rigor, they talk about what they used, the themes and how they developed them. They had a cultural advisor. So that, again, is ticking a box of good research process. They did audit trails, and they used reliable surveys. You could actually have a look at that survey, because then you might be able to comment that this was an appropriate survey. They de-identified the different data phases and then move them together. This is their sort of age range. So 54, so you could then identify and say, is this appropriate for First Nations people with chronic disease? It's fairly young, but I think if you'd find it with the Australian Health and Welfare, that'd be quite appropriate. And this is where they've sort of built the qual results and integrated it sort of with looking at sort of how the domains of the survey were then brought together with their qualitative comments. And so you can see here that this is the domains and also then the sort of the comments. I'll just get it. Right, so how have we gone? So any other questions? So I think as you're going through, I'll just get to really look at, so you've got 2 weeks for this one, but you'll also have your other assignments and things coming in. So as you work on this one, sort of think about your planning for your other assignments and other study process. You can also look to see what sort of marks. I've done with a couple of students, worked out what marks they actually need to get to achieve a pass because of the fact that they've not done so well in A2. And so look at your, you know that 20% is your quizzes, 30% is your A2. So you can add up those marks to work out, okay, so what do I need to get? If I get 50% and up to 60%, will that bring me to a pass overall? Knowing that this next assignment is worth 50%. So you need to pass it definitely. Did super well. If you did super well in A2, then you really won't be lost in A3 because it's just you've obviously got the process of summarizing and then critiquing. So just Roxanne is making a comment. No, there's a whole heap of comments coming through. Yeah, so struggle with the depth. So the depth, we'll go back to this concise writing. So the depth is where you bring the idea up and then add to it. So often students do a very lovely summary for us, but then haven't got any reason. So make sure as you're writing that you've got a reason. So, you know, in this one, it's got, you know, look at the way they've done, you know, concurrent mix methods. So they've done surveys, they've done interviews. So give me the depth. What sort of interviews did they do? Did they align them with the surveys? Did they do them at the same time? Because what you need to demonstrate is you understand what you're reading in that article, which I know in some ways you're probably not really understanding it, but you're trying to understand it. And so you might need to do some other reading to look at, okay, so what does mixed method mean? What does thematic analysis mean? So, you know, when they say, if rather than just writing, they completed a thematic analysis with the interviews, give me the depth of saying they read the interview transcripts and then they identified similar phrases to which aligned with the health literacy domains to come up with the themes. Yeah. Finding it hard to put in the paper this time. So I think the first thing, Roxanne, is to highlight in the paper. So go through the paper and highlight the sections that align with the table. So with the word count is hard because the whole thing is to try and to get you to not just sort of provide a big summary, but to be concise. And so as you go through your highlighting and putting the words onto the table, then start writing. Okay, so if you've got, you know, 50 words for the introduction, the PO, so think about, you might write that in 100 words and then you reduce it down. And so you might write, you know, this research, or, you know, so if you sort of to make looking at the word, so rather than saying, you know, this research, can you just say that, you know, the persons with chronic disease, or no, First Nations people with chronic disease were the population, and they looked at their health literacy levels as they were in, you know, coming into hospital or something. So that shows that you're able to look at the population, the point of interest, and the outcome. The table is in your actual A3 rubric. So that's, you need to go, if you haven't got the rubric, that's what you need to go back to. Back to because the table's on the actual A2806 A3 instructions. It's got all the information that we've been talking about. To make sure, the other thing to do with your word count is once you've got the assignment is to go back over it. So reading it out aloud helps you remove words. Reading it and going, okay, this section is about the sample, but don't have anything. If you've then got your next section is about the analysis, make sure that you haven't repeated what you've got in the sample. If you're talking about the sort of results, make sure you're not talking about the analysis. So this is how you get that word count down, because you need to make sure you're not repeating information. And I think that is just the art of sort of using the table and then moving the table into the paragraphs. And that's where I would start with the Word doc, where you've got the table on one Word doc and our headings on another Word doc, and then print out the criteria that you're actually getting marked on in another one. So then you can actually start to write and think, right, 50 words. So what am I writing in this section? Have I accurately identified the sections that I need to? Yes, I have. Moving on. Then I'm looking at the literature review. So I might want to justify that, yes, chronic disease is definitely a problem with Indigenous, but don't talk about the sample size. Use that in the sample size. So you can choose the parts that you want to critique, but your criteria, remember, wants you to accurately identify, so that there's a difference in this, in your ability to accurately identify and comprehensive explanation of all the elements. And so this is where you want the main elements to be presented, which is why we've given you the table, so that you don't, you know, who the authors are in this particular one is not a main element. You might want one small comment about the quality of the journal or the quality of the authors, but don't spend too much words on it. You know, you want a strong element on the actual methodology, but remember, you've got a lot of words to write on that methodology. When you look at that slide, you know, that's 250 words on the research design. And so that's a lot of words to write about a concurrent mixed method research. So that does enable you to really tell us what you know about that research design and whether it's appropriate. That allows, I think in that section, it has the what type, the rationale, research questions, and you could say that your critique could be, no, the research question is not clear because several of you have asked where it is. So that's your critique, and then you would use your justification as maybe a research text or one of the criteria, the mixed method, where it talks about the research question should be clear. It shouldn't be embedded in the aim, which is lost in the background. Then where was there a need for the study? And so you might have talked in the abstract about the actual, is it relevant and comprehensive, and then lead on from that, saying that, yes, it is an appropriate research design for this particular population. Can you see how your table helps you to put what you need into the word count that you have, which enables you then to meet the criteria, which is accurately identify the different areas? It seemed to make sense to us, so hopefully it does actually make sense to you. But the thing with a marking criteria on a research assignment is that we are looking for you to demonstrate knowledge and understanding by doing a research report, which is an expectation as a clinician. And we know that because we've talked about evidence-based and being able to understand, critique, and use. So that's what your report is. It's understanding, critiquing, and then your relevance to clinical practice. And then our marking criteria looks at, have you been able to critique and find the different elements? Have you been able to evaluate and say they're good, bad, or indifferent? And have you been able to use them and sort of look at how they can be used in the clinical area? Right, I think I've talked enough. How does that sound to you? The sun's actually come out down the Gold Coast. I'm actually on campus, so that I did pass a few students because I was over at the hospital who were coming off shift. So it was very nice to see a few faces. So the credibility of the information. So have a look at, I think maybe did you have good references that supported that? Megan, it may be useful if you, I organised to meet with you separately. I've done that with quite a few students to help them understand what their comments mean, because sometimes picking out a comment without the context of the assignment is quite difficult for me to actually give you an informative answer as opposed to just a very general answer. Because I could say that probably it might have related to what you use to justify that information, or it may just be the way you've written it. Because what we were looking for is that evidence of that you understood enough to use in your own words. Some of the students did that really well, but as you can see from the mean, a lot of students were more just providing us evidence that they read the article and were able to summarize it, but not really fully understand it. And I think that comes from sort of reading the modules and understanding and looking at the articles that we've got in the readings to sort of really understand what it means. And so, yeah, so as you're sort of looking at this article, look at the words. One of the words that is yarning. So what does that mean, for Indigenous people? How could you bring that into your relevance to clinical nursing practice? How do you actually have that as a sort of bringing the article and significance of what they talked about in yarning as delivery of health information? How is that good? What are other articles and references that can you use to justify that, yes, that's an appropriate way to work with Indigenous people? They also used that aspect of yarning as they did their interviews. So they did it as a sort of, they didn't just ask questions, they did it as a story, an interaction. And so you might find some nice references where other people had done that similar with to make sure it's culturally safe. Right, well, I shall turn the recording off so that we actually have a recording that is the right length of time.